Welcome to another Inspired Content Top 10 list. This time we're going to be looking at comics, but we're going to kind of stick with my usual set of rules. Sort of, not entirely, because the rules I usually have for these are this first set of lists are going to be my top 10 favorites, with the exception that each publisher or creator gets one entry on the list. So as much as I would love to do more on including something like the Marvel series, just look at the art of the cover for this one. This doesn't make the list because there's already another entry for Marvel on here. Now I say I sort of stick into this rule because I have the caveat that there is a joint publishing venture that includes Marvel and an entry for Marvel separately. So there's a little bit of that going on. But for the most part, I try to keep it to one publisher gets one entry on the list. This one's a little more tricky, in part because um, the the comics industry is so heavily dominated by a very few small actors, and so there's some of them that are overlap, and there's a little bit of a trick to some of it as well, because DC and Marvel have purchased other comic providers, and there's a whole messy tangle of who owns Top Cow, who owns Image, who owns Vertigo, and keeping track of some of this stuff is it's a trick. There's subsidiaries and owners and collaborators and stuff that just gets really messy really quickly. It's sort of eye-opening if you take a look into the history of it. But for this adventure, I'm trying to keep it as much as possible as individual publishers who can distinguish from themselves. Now there is some trickiness to that. So like the first example on my list here is Tank Girl. Now if you catch the cover there just in the corner, it does say DC Vertigo on the cover. My understanding is the original publishing of Tank Girl was not published through those labels. And so I felt like I could include it just because it is one of my top 10 for the sheer post-apocalyptic punk aesthetic and not just the aesthetic that's punk, it's the attitude that's punk. So that gets my top spot for that. It's fun, it's raunchy, it's rude, it's a good run. Okay, the next one on my list here, I've got a couple of the issues, and that's the thing is this is an individual comics. This is series or runs of something. So what we've got here, I will cycle. I can't hold them all up at once, so I'll just do a few of them. Amalgam Comics, Magneto and the Magnetic Men, Challengers of the Fantastic. And this is one of the ones that I was talking about muddies the water about individual publishers getting one slot. is this is a joint venture between Marvel and DC. So like this one here is Doctor Strange Fate. It's a combination of Doctor Fate and Doctor Strange. Pretty straightforward. It includes a few other characters like the Skulk and which I believe is sort of like a cross between Solomon Grundy and the Hulk. But they also include some characters like Lobo the Duck, which is a little more tongue-in-cheek. It's Lobo and Howard the Duck combined. I don't agree with all the choices they made for combinations, but I do like some of them. Like for me, Wolverine and Batman, that was Blade. Come on, Batman and Blade. That's what you should have done. But I still had some fun with it, some of them at any rate. And so I kind of wish I had more stories from that. But what we got, I think we got 2 runs of that and Marvel versus DC. And we got Access, which was a series. And I've got pretty much all of that, I believe. The Access is sort of like a revisit. So that's one of them, and that counts because I have Marvel and DC on this list again. But it was done under a different label that was neither Marvel owned or DC owned. It was a joint venture between the two, I believe. So that's one of my sort of cheats on this here. The next cheat, well, it's not really a cheat. This is the Marvel run, and it may appear at first to be a strange choice to go with DP7 out of Marvel. It was a hard pick, guys. I'm not kidding. There were so many different things I could have done for Marvel. Like, clearly the artwork of the Marvel series that I showed you the one of the volumes of was so much better. The artwork on these are not great, and the world building and setting on some of the other Marvel stuff that I could do. Age of Apocalypse is one of the ones that I could do, but we're not going to go into that. The reason I'm going for DP7 is it's a departure from the standard Marvel universe. It's a full departure. Wolverine doesn't exist in this setting. Punisher doesn't exist in this setting. That's a different universe. This is still Marvel, but it's not the Marvel universe that you know and remember. It's DP stands for Displaced Paranormals. And it's of its time a unique spin on trying to create a whole new comic book universe that's separate from the standard ones that we've known since the 50s and 60s. This was done in, I believe, the 80s. 1986. And the exploration of what it means, there aren't mutants, there aren't Inhumans, there aren't the Kree and the Skrull and the Fantastic Four. None of that exists in this setting. And it's for that, the boldness and the ambition to just wipe the slate clean and start over from a new perspective is part of the reason why that made it onto the list, where others that I've collected over the years aren't on this list yet. If you want a list of some of my favorite Marvel adventures and world building and characters, that'll be a separate list if you tell me which ones you want, because I will organize my list accordingly. Moving on to the next one. this is the other half of that equation. We had Amalgam, which was Marvel and DC. Then we had Marvel. Now we've got DC. And I gotta say, this is 3 volumes of the 4-volume set. Superman, Batman Generations. And this is distinctly a different exploration of the timelines of DC's 2 main characters, Batman and Superman. We've got, I don't have the first one, which is, I believe, the 40s to 50s. Because each of these takes place in a different era of the timeline of the heroes here. So we've got 1979, 89, 1999 to 1929, 1959 to 1969. It's sort of like if you wanted a alternate history of Superman and Batman through the centuries, well, through the last century and into the future. This was sort of beautiful in the way that the story was done. So it's a 4-book series. This is book 3 of 4, 4 of 4, 2 of 4. Yeah, so it says Superman and Batman Generations, an Imaginary Tale. But it includes, I don't want to do any spoilers, so I won't spoil it for you, but it is highly worth it. And if we could get movies for the DC made based off of these, and an equivalent for Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Flash, that would be worth it. That would be a cinematic universe for DC that I would really, really love. So that's DC. Now, there are some things out there like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and a few others, but they fall under the label of being published by I believe, the copies I have of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are published by Marvel. So that can't qualify. I don't know if they were ever published under an independent label. And so now we get into some of the tricky territory of who owns these. Because this is Freaks. It was done by Malibu, but I think Malibu's subsequently been bought. I don't know by who. So there's a question in my mind whether or not I'm allowed to do that based on my existing rules. But I thought the concept of Freaks was interesting. It wasn't so much a mutants for mutants' sake. This is one of those, a mad scientist experimented on infants. This is very similar in some ways to The Boys, but not quite. It's very tricky to really peg down. And they didn't do a whole long run of them. It's very short. It didn't last very long, which is unfortunate because there's a bunch of story there that I'm curious about. And next on the list is another one like who owns it, because I feel like it's owned by somebody else now. Is Image Comics still independent? I don't know. But Image Comics did a series called, you'll catch a theme here, Freak Force. And this was partly fun because they did the classic heroes redone style. So there's a cyborg super patriot who's Captain America meets Winter Soldier meets Cyborg. And so it's a little bit derivative, but it's fun in its own way. And I think there was definitely room for exploring some more of the quirky build of characters. So there was a character that looks very much derived from Rogue from X-Men. And she got her powers from a mad scientist. She used to work as a adult, well, I don't want to get too much into detail. She worked in the adult industry, I guess we'll call it. There was a spiky looking demon girl who's sort of a play on the role that Nightcrawler played. So there's a little bit of play with some of those ideas, but they gave it enough of its own spin that it's done in such a way that the characters are distinct. Like you can see where they're coming from, what the history of their replacements are. But at the same time, it's their own thing in enough of a way that allows you to do different stories with them. Okay, so something that was really original, and I've got more on this series. I've got more copies of this series. But this is... You may have heard of this. This is a American publishing of a comic from overseas based on the idea that centuries ago one of the great libraries in the Middle East was burned, and the references, the knowledge in that library was looted and thrown into the river, and somehow, some way, some of the principles of what is it, the 99 virtues of Allah or Muhammad are sent out among humanity to absorb. And so you've got these people who are empowered by some of these 99 virtues or whatever. I'm a little shady on some of the details of some of the information about it, but I thought it was an interesting enough take and an interesting enough concept for a superhero storyline that I definitely was impressed by the idea. Okay, so now, next on this list is, I might have to shift over here. No, okay, we're doing all right. So this one, I couldn't find my copies of it. It's somewhere in the boxes. But this is Star Wars Legacy. This is the future I want to see for the future of Star Wars. This is the son or grandson of Luke Skywalker. Makes an appearance in this as a character. The Sith Empire has risen and overthrown the Jedi Empire, roughly. So what you see on the cover here is Imperial Jedi. So they work for the good emperor who is overthrown and is on the run. And they are technically light side Jedi. Maybe moving a little towards gray Jedi. But they're sort of a combination of the Imperial Guards and Jedi. The distinction is there's been a schism in the Jedi Order. These Jedi serve the Empire, not the evil Palpatine Empire, but the Empire that is the heir to the Republic. Whereas the Jedi Order serves the Force, these serve the Emperor. And it was an interesting take, because the Emperor, I forget the name of the Emperor on this one, but the Emperor in Exile is a Force-trained light Jedi. And he's been overthrown by the Sith Empire with the somewhat famous red Twi'lek with Sith tattoos character that you can kind of see everywhere. But I just thought, like, this was a twist. This was a new direction. It was taking the idea of, like, the Empire didn't have to be evil. You could have a good empire and a bad empire. Just as you can have a good republic and a corrupt, evil republic. And you can have Jedi that split forming between serving the Force and serving the Empire. That's an interesting play. Like the Jedi divided make a balance issue with opposing the Sith. It's a very interesting take on the concept, and I wish it had become canon for the new setting up of the future of Star Wars. Okay, next one on the list is Girl Genius. I was a big fan of this for a very long time. I've subsequently stopped reading it over the last few years just because I don't have the time to keep up with where the storyline's going. But you can read this for free on Girl Genius Comic Online or Girl Genius Online. But you can also get it as a book. It was published as a book. I think there's an audio book. There's a role-playing game for it. But you can read the webcomic. And so this is sort of a cheat, again, because it's predominantly done as a webcomic these days. But it was published as a graphic novel that you can find. The graphic novel was published at one point. I think they did the first several volumes as a published collection. Basically, this is a steampunk Europe ruled by sparks, who are mad science geniuses of one kind or another. And there's a evil force at work, and you have the main character, Agatha Heterodyne. I don't want to say too much more. It's totally worth like going to the website, starting from the start, and seeing how much you can get into the storyline. It's worth a look. I recommend it heartily. I followed it for 8 years at least. And this is another webcomic of a sort. This one's unique in the sense that I don't know that this would translate to a published book well. The artist for this, whose name's Michelle something, but the style and technique in this, gorgeous artwork. If you look up Ava's Demon online, you'll find it. The reason it doesn't, I don't think it would translate too well to a graphic novel, is there are key points in the storyline where there are motion graphics, musical elements, and animations to it. And the artist's use of these elements to create a comic that's distinctly part of the medium it's being used in. Like, there's a genius to doing what she's done with this. In the fact that you can only really experience it in its entirety on the web. Now there's some loss of some of that being the case, because I can't own a volume of that as a book on my shelf. But I think the artistic brilliance of it, I think, is just mind-blowing for me. And the art itself of the comic is beautiful artwork. The story is very unique. I don't know how I would describe this. It's not full-on science fiction. It's not fantasy. I mean, if you're really, really stretching for it, you could say this is a science fantasy similar to Star Wars. But it's not. It's not the same thing. I'm running a little long here. We're almost at 30 minutes, and I can't justify keeping that up for much longer. And I hope I can upload this as is. I've had some issues with YouTube telling me my videos are running too long. So that's what I'll give you as my list of comics for this episode. I will see you for my next top 10 in a month on the 15th of February. Until then, keep reading, I guess. I'm running way too long here.